question has been raised, what is the fate of those who have never heard the gospel? On the one hand, it seems inherently unfair that they should simply be damned because they have never had an opportunity to hear the gospel. And that's a very fair point. We do need to bear in mind, however, that salvation is not a justice issue. It's not a question of fairness, it's a question of grace, God's grace for various people. But here's what I would say. Let's start with Romans 1. Romans 1 tells us that the reality of God and the power of God is evident in all of His creation. Nobody is absolutely ignorant of the fact that there is a God and that He is almighty. And so what Paul says in Romans 1 is that the problem is not that nobody's ever heard of God. There's nobody on the planet who has not heard of or knows something about the biblical God. The problem is, says Paul, that they have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So you are held accountable for what you know, and what you do with what you know is what Paul is saying in Romans 1, 18 to 26. Let me repeat that. You are held accountable for what you know about God and what you do with what you know about God. And so it is simply not the case that anybody is lost because they haven't heard the gospel. That's point number one. Point number two is that God is not finished with any of us yet. Let's take the case of Israel. Romans 9 through 11 tells us that God still has a plan for Jews who have not received Jesus, even after this life. That is, he says that when Christ comes back, there will be a large conversion of Jews. And according to Romans 11, 25 and 26, all Israel will be saved. They will have an opportunity to embrace their Messiah when Jesus comes back. Now, I would assume that since we have a gracious God, and since it is the case that Paul is prepared to say this about Jews, God's first chosen people, that he would probably say the very same thing about those who have never heard the gospel. That there will come a day at the end of God's salvation plan when those who have not yet heard the good news will have an opportunity to respond either positively or negatively when Jesus comes again to raise the quick and the dead, to bring in last judgment, and to bring in the new creation. So the short answer is, God's not finished with any of us yet. Stay tuned. The story is still ongoing. And secondly, nobody is lost simply because they haven't heard the good news.